Imagine you are walking down a cobblestone street in Ice Age Europe, roughly 50,000 years ago. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe, and the landscape is a brutal mix of frozen tundra and glacial steppe. Then you see them, not us. You see the true masters of this frozen hellscape, and they are terrifyingly familiar. They are Neanderthals. If you thought early humans were just big, hairy cave people, prepare for a serious expectation check. Because if you met a Neanderthal today, you wouldn't be looking at some evolutionary roadkill. You would be looking at a creature so intensely muscled, so adapted to blunt force trauma, that the strongest powerlifter you know would look like they needed a sandwich. We have spent decades framing Neanderthals as the failed evolutionary sideline, the knuckle-dragging losers who couldn't keep up. That narrative is tired, inaccurate, and frankly, insulting to our cousins.
The scientific reality is bizarre. Neanderthals were absolute units of evolution. They were physically superior in almost every metric useful for survival in a lethal environment. They had bigger brains than us. They dominated Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They hunted animals that make a modern grizzly bear look like a house cat. So here is the million-dollar question, the paleontological paradox that keeps researchers up at night. If Neanderthals were so much stronger, so well adapted, and so successful, why are we here talking about them in the past tense, while their line is long gone? Why did the physically weaker, less cold-adapted Homo sapiens, our ancestors, win the evolutionary Super Bowl? Today on The Lost World, we are diving deep into the massive bodies, the meticulous hunting strategies, and the ultimately fatal specialization of the Neanderthals. This isn't just a story about strength versus smarts. This is the story of how the Short King, the seemingly inferior Homo sapiens, won a war purely based on logistics and social networking. Part 1. The Neanderthal, an absolute unit of carnivorous beef. Let's start with the basics. Forget what you learned in high school history or whatever the nearest dino normie told you about cavemen. The Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalensis, was the physical peak predator of the Pleistocene. Imagine building a tank out of human flesh and bone. That's what a Neanderthal was. Their bodies were built low and wide. A typical male Neanderthal stood maybe 5 feet 5 inches, hence their short king status, but they weighed, on average, 30 to 40 pounds more than a modern human of the same height. This wasn't fat, this was muscle and incredibly dense bone. Researchers studying the cross-sections of their limb bones found that Neanderthal femurs and humeri were thicker and denser than those of any modern Olympic athlete.
Their arms were specialized for massive rotational force, meaning they didn't just throw spears, they probably thrust them into prey with the force of a small compact car hitting a wall. Their entire morphology was a biological adaptation to extreme cold, following Bergmann's rule. Having a shorter, stockier body minimizes surface area relative to volume, retaining heat far better than our long, lanky tropical bodies. They had a massive rib cage, often described as barrel-chested, suggesting huge lungs capable of processing massive amounts of oxygen necessary for their high-octane lifestyle. And they needed that energy. Based on isotopic analysis of their bone collagen, which tells us what they ate, Neanderthals were hypercarnivores. They ate meat and lots of it. A 2018 study led by Dr. Herman Poncer estimated that a typical active Neanderthal male required around 4,500 calories per day just to maintain body temperature and energy output in the glacial environment.
That's nearly double what a modern desk worker needs, and significantly more than a professional athlete in season. This wasn't just venison, folks. We're talking megafauna. Fossil evidence shows Neanderthals consistently targeted some of the most dangerous animals that ever walked the earth: woolly mammoths, cave bears, which are nightmare fuel on 4 legs, giant deer, and woolly rhinos. These were not opportunistic scavenger kills. These were deliberate, close-quarters battles. How do we know? Look at the road maps of injury etched into their bones. The famous Shanidar cave remains, particularly Shanidar 1, show a man who survived grievous injuries, a crushing blow to the head, loss of an arm, and massive trauma to his feet. But it's not just Shanidar. Analysis of dozens of Neanderthal skeletons across Europe reveals a pattern of skeletal trauma eerily similar to that seen in modern professional rodeo riders: broken ribs, battered skulls, compressed vertebrae.
They were getting slammed, gored, and trampled on a regular basis. They were constantly in wrestling distance of massive, angry beasts. This lifestyle was brutal, short, and required immense physical resilience. Their technology, the Mousterian toolkit, perfectly reflected this close-quarters combat style. These were sophisticated tools, certainly a cut above earlier hominins. They perfected the levallois technique, a complex method of preparing a core stone to consistently produce razor-sharp flakes of specific shapes and sizes. These were efficient tools, excellent for cutting hides, butchering meat, and hafting onto spears. But crucially, these were thrusting spears. They didn't have the sophisticated long-distance throwing spears or bows and arrows that H. sapiens would later master. They had to get personal.
So picture it. A Neanderthal hunting party, equipped with sharp stone points, relies purely on coordination, physical power, and sheer grit to bring down a 7-ton mammoth. Absolute units through and through. This brings us to the first major conceptual gap. If they were so physically dominant, if they could survive such trauma, and if they were intelligent enough to execute complex hunts of dangerous prey, what did Homo sapiens have that could possibly trump this biological brute force? Part 2. The brain game. Size versus structure. Here's another myth killer. Neanderthals were not the dim-witted cousins. Their cranial capacity averaged around 1,500 cubic centimeters. Ours, Homo sapiens, averages closer to 1,350 cubic centimeters. Wait, what? They had bigger brains? Yes, but the structure of that brain appears to have been subtly different, and those subtle differences became decisive.
Research suggests that a larger proportion of the Neanderthal brain was dedicated to vision and motor control. This makes evolutionary sense. Living in low-light, high-latitude environments, glacial Europe, having excellent visual acuity and rapid motor processing was essential for survival and hunting. They literally needed massive processing power just to see and operate effectively in their demanding world. However, recent studies, including volumetric reconstructions of the Neanderthal endocast, the interior mold of the skull, suggest they had smaller frontal and parietal lobes relative to their overall brain size compared to Homo sapiens. These areas are crucial for complex planning, abstract thought, symbolic communication, and, most importantly, social networking. While Neanderthals certainly had culture, they buried their dead, potentially cared for the sick, as seen in Shanidar 1 Survival, and used pigments, their cultural complexity seems to have plateaued.
For over 200,000 years, their core tool technology remained essentially the same, the dependable Mousterian kit. It was effective, but it was static. Evolutionarily speaking, they were specialized, perhaps too specialized. Imagine a highly effective machine built for one perfect purpose. That was the Neanderthal. Now consider Homo sapiens. When we arrived in Europe and Asia around 45,000 years ago, we brought the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Within a blink of geological time, just a few thousand years, our toolkit exploded into unbelievable complexity. We developed blades, scrapers, engraving tools, and crucially, specialized hunting weapons. We invented the atlatl, or spear thrower, which fundamentally changed the risk assessment of hunting. Instead of wrestling a woolly rhino, you could kill it from 50 yards away. This reduced the rodeo rider trauma rate considerably, improving longevity and reproductive success.
Furthermore, our culture was inherently volatile and innovative. We were not content with the old way. We didn't just survive, we adapted, changed, and developed complex symbolic systems almost obsessively. We started painting bizarre, intricate images deep in caves like Chauvet and Lascaux. We carved Venus figurines and flutes. This wasn't just decoration, this was a form of information storage and social glue. This difference in cognitive processing, the ability to innovate rapidly and use abstract symbolism, translates directly to logistics and resource management, which became the real nightmare fuel for the Neanderthals. Part 3. The power of the weak, endurance, and networks. If Neanderthals were the absolute units built for wrestling, Homo sapiens were the long-distance runners built for efficiency. We are gracile, our bones are lighter, our limbs are longer relative to our torsos. We look weaker on paper, but we possess a hidden superpower, endurance.
In the African savanna, our ancestors specialized in persistence hunting, the ability to run down prey until the animal literally collapsed from exhaustion or heat stroke. Even in the cold climates of Europe, this physical structure provided a metabolic advantage. We required fewer calories because we were built lighter and needed less fuel to maintain our body temperature, though we used complex clothing and shelter, of course.
But the true, decisive victory wasn't fought on the plains. It was fought in the social sphere. Neanderthal populations were small, sparse, and highly localized. Based on genetic diversity studies, their effective population size was never very large, perhaps just a few thousand individuals scattered across a continent. We find Neanderthal artifacts and tools generally only spread over short distances, maybe 100 kilometers. They were self-sufficient, relying on immediate local resources.
This specialization was magnificent during stable climate periods, but the Pleistocene was anything but stable. The period between 80,000 and 30,000 years ago was characterized by extreme, rapid climate fluctuations known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events. Temperatures could plunge or soar dramatically within mere decades. When the tundra expanded or retreated suddenly, local resource pools, like a particular herd of deer or a critical source of flint, could vanish. For the Neanderthals, highly dependent on specific local resources, this was catastrophic. If their local mammoth population migrated or died, they faced starvation with limited fallback options. Enter Homo sapiens, the social butterflies. Archaeological evidence shows that H. sapiens maintained vast social and trading networks. We find toolstone, like specialized chert or obsidian, that traveled hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 miles from its source. A 2021 study focused on lithic materials in Spain showed that sapiens groups had routine contact and trade over areas 10 times larger than the average Neanderthal territory. What does this mean? If the climate shifts and your local food source disappears, or your favorite flint quarry freezes over, you don't panic. You call your cousins 500 miles away who are living in a slightly different ecological zone, and you trade. You share risk. Dr. Clive Finlayson, among others, argues compellingly that Neanderthals were simply less resilient to population bottlenecks caused by localized resource failure. Homo sapiens had a continent-wide insurance policy, thanks to language, symbolic culture, and cooperative trade. This massive, intricate web of social connection meant that while an individual Homo sapiens might be weaker than a Neanderthal, the collective sapiens organism was infinitely stronger. This ability to communicate complex, abstract ideas, the logistics of a trade route, the abstract concept of kinship with someone you've never met, the shared narrative of a clan, was the true weapon. It allowed for the successful colonization of virtually every niche, from coastal zones to high mountains, while the Neanderthal remained tied to the brutal steppe. Part 4. The final overlap: competition, mixing, and fading. The overlap between our two species was long. For perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 years, they coexisted in the same harsh landscapes. It wasn't an instant annihilation event. It was a slow, inexorable competitive exclusion, similar to two different species of squirrels competing for the same limited nut supply. Only one squirrel is slightly more efficient at storing resources for the winter. The two species weren't total strangers either. We know they hooked up. If you are of non-African descent, congratulations. You carry, on average, about 1% to 4% Neanderthal DNA. This residual genetic material is proof of interbreeding events that occurred roughly 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, likely when Homo sapiens first left Africa and encountered the resident short kings of the Levant and Europe. And what did we get from this bizarre biological exchange? Some researchers suggest we inherited genes that boosted our immune systems, helping us deal with European pathogens we hadn't encountered before. We also got genes linked to higher altitude adaptation, and perhaps even lighter skin and red hair. Essentially, the Neanderthal gave us a genetic software patch to better handle their environment before they exited the stage. So why did they fade if they were interbreeding? It wasn't a sudden, violent genocide, though conflicts undoubtedly occurred. The leading theories converge on subtle, cumulative disadvantages for the Neanderthals. 1.
Caloric deficit and reproductive rate. Remember that 4,500 kilocalorie requirement? During times of climate stress, those massive specialized Neanderthal bodies were far harder to feed than the lighter sapiens bodies. Furthermore, studies suggest Neanderthals had longer intervals between successful births than H. sapiens. If a Neanderthal mother needed 4 or 5 years of intense caloric input and protection to raise one child in a lethal environment, while a sapiens mother could manage a slightly shorter interval due to more efficient social resource sharing, the math quickly favors H. sapiens. A small 1% annual difference in population growth rate becomes absolutely insurmountable over 10,000 years. 2. Disease load. Another possibility involves the introduction of novel diseases. H. sapiens migrating out of Africa may have carried diseases to which they had resistance, but which acted as nightmare fuel plagues against the immunologically naive Neanderthals. This is often called the African bomb theory, analogous to what happened when Europeans encountered Native Americans centuries later. The three geography trap. The last Neanderthal populations retreated to the fringes of Europe, notably Gibraltar, Gorham's Cave, where they held out until possibly 28,000 BCE. They were backed into ecological corners, clinging to the familiar, specialized lifestyle, unable to adapt fast enough to the massive influx of H. sapiens populations and the increasingly volatile climate. They were specialists in a world that suddenly demanded generalists. It wasn't a loss of strength, it was a loss of adaptability, flexibility, and connectivity. Think of it this way. The Neanderthal was the perfect custom-built supercomputer running proprietary software from 200,000 BCE. It was incredibly fast at its specific tasks, hunting, surviving cold. Homo sapiens was the mass-produced laptop running constantly updated open-source software.
It might have been slower initially, but it could connect to the network, download new programs, tools, strategies, cultures, and adapt to any challenge thrown its way. When the environment changed, the supercomputer bricked, and the connected laptop downloaded the fix. The ultimate irony is that our weakness, our gracile, seemingly inferior bodies, forced us to rely on our most powerful organ, the complex social brain. We became masters of logistics, cooperation, and narrative, and that is what saved us. Part 5. The Lesson of the Short King. So we defeated the absolute units. The superior hunter, the muscle-bound Markle, the short king of the Ice Age faded away. R.I.P. Homo neanderthalensis. The death of the Neanderthal wasn't just a geological tragedy, it's a profound lesson in competitive biology. It tells us that physical dominance is fleeting, and intense specialization can be a fatal flaw when the environment shifts rapidly.
We succeeded because we were inherently, profoundly collaborative. Consider a modern analogy. Neanderthals were like highly specialized small boutique businesses operating in isolated towns. They made the absolute best products, but if a recession hit their town, they folded. Homo sapiens were like a giant decentralized franchise chain. Maybe the quality was slightly lower, weaker muscles, smaller toolkits initially, but the network was global. If one branch failed, the others pumped resources back into it, kept the brand going, and ensured collective survival. Our complex language, our abstract art, our music, our ritual burials that bonded groups across vast distances, these were not luxuries, they were survival tools, every bit as crucial as the atlatl or fire. They were the mechanisms that allowed a single individual in France to rely indirectly on the resources gathered by an individual in Spain.
The Neanderthals, while demonstrating care for their wounded and perhaps even engaging in ritualistic behavior, seem to have lacked the sheer scale and reach of this cooperation. Their worlds were small, intimate, and profoundly fragile. This is why today, every single one of us, from the smallest child to the strongest adult, carries the legacy of the short king, Homo sapiens, who won by being the ultimate generalist, the ultimate collaborator, and the ultimate storyteller. We adapted, not just biologically, but culturally, at an exponential rate the Neanderthal could not match. If you enjoyed diving deep into this bizarre evolutionary rivalry, learning about the short king physicality of the Neanderthals, and uncovering the secret sapiens weapon, please smash that like button. It helps us tremendously in bringing more detailed, scientifically rigorous content from the lost world to you. And if you are not already subscribed, hit subscribe and join our growing legion of history nerds and paleontological enthusiasts. The demise of the Neanderthal reminds us that true strength isn't just about muscle mass or bone density. It is about adaptability, resilience, and the willingness to look beyond immediate experience and cooperate with the unseen community. We look back at them not as inferior ancestors, but as our robust, tragic cousins who specialized too brilliantly for a world that wouldn't sit still. Thanks for watching, and until next time on The Lost World.